Welcome here this evening. This, I think, is the fourth of the summer lecture series. There's one more at the end of September. And since all of you except one are part of our church, I will be doing a monthly lecture in the fall related to our preaching series. So those announcements will be coming out in September. So I'm again thankful to this summer. I have learned a lot about Indigenous culture and Indigenous people. I went on the bus tour with other MCBC pastors in July, and also was at the event at the Longhouse. I think Waldo and Eleanor were there as well. Were you there, Laura?
No, I was having cataract operation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and so I've learned a lot from Indigenous people, and so I'm thankful to be having this gathering here this evening on the traditional territories of the Mathicli and Sumas people. And I also will have a quote from Richard Wagamies a couple of times in the lecture, because there's so many connections between traditions there that I think it's good to note those. Our lives are filled with noise and people talking and lots of actions. This is why silence, solitude, and Sabbath go together. Sabbath simply means to stop. That is the definition of the word. And now my clicker isn't going here.
It's not.
Then I may have to bend down and do this. There we go. There's my stop sign. To stop being busy, to stop incessant chatter, to stop our normal everyday activities. And in a sense, this practice is the central one of all spiritual practices, to stop all the doing and to just be. That's why my title, We Are Human Beings, Not Human Doings. Especially, I think, Mennonites tend to be doers. And there's nothing wrong with doing, but sometimes we just need to stop doing and just be. It's the simplest and the easiest of all spiritual practices. And that's why I say it kind of lies at the core of all of them. Such as prayer. We have to stop and pray. We have service is doing, but we need to stop and think about what we're doing. Worship, same thing. I love this quote here from Richard Wagamies. He often has his little dialogues. This is not an actual conversation, but he makes up these little conversations between himself and an old wise woman. And so here's the conversation. What's the best way to learn to be spiritual? The question perhaps we all ask. And the old woman says, pack light. What do you mean? Carry only what you need for the journey. Don't tire yourself out with unnecessary stuff. Like what? Like your head, like your talk. Spirituality isn't found in your head, it's found in your heart. It isn't found in big, important sounding words or long speeches. Good reminder for this evening. It's found in silence. If you travel with your heart and you're quiet, you will find the way to be spiritual. I found my first step on the journey that day. It may be the first step, but I find that I need to learn that one over and over and over again. In fact, I need it this evening because I scurried around a little bit too much. Before coming here, we had a couple of our kids over for supper and had to give one of them a ride home, and so I was getting a little go, go, go. And I thought, I think I need this lecture tonight. So I need it more than anybody else here. I like this picture because it's taken on the Sisters of Loretto Farm in Kentucky. I stayed there it's a convent, with an active operating farm. And I found it a rather contrast to have this white marble Virgin of Mary statue, and in behind is a red barn and a manure spreader. And it's not only a contrast of colors, but kind of a contrast of what you think of when you think of those two. And yet, I want to use that picture to say that silence, solitude, and Sabbath can be practiced in the midst of ordinary life. It isn't practiced by going to some sort of nice place with statues. It can be practiced in the middle of operating a farm. It's not meant to be somehow somewhere else or a special place. It can be done in the midst of ordinary life. Yet at the same time, it is good to have special places for silence, solitude, and Sabbath. I also had the privilege a number of years ago to travel to the island of Iona.
The camera. I'm thinking of the camera for you.
Oh, I'm moving away, thank you. Joel said, if you're going to move this way. Thanks for the reminder. I had the privilege of traveling to the island of Iona, which has been dedicated for more than 1,500 years to practicing silence, solitude, and Sabbath. So people go there on pilgrimage just because of that long tradition. And in fact, they say that it's a thin place where the distance between God and earth is just a little bit less than everywhere else. Of course, I don't believe that. I think it's the same distance everywhere you go. But I understand what they're trying to say. Because for 1,500 years they have been practicing this, it is a special place. And so it's good to have special places. And you may have a special place in your house, where you sit with your morning coffee, or perhaps a special chair that you sit in, an easy chair where you feel just content to just be. So I think it's okay to have special places, even though this practice can be done in the midst of a busy, ordinary life. So I'd like to do a bit of sharing before we get into the subject matter. What's your favorite place? Do you have a favorite place to just kind of get away? Perhaps a place in a park, or a walk, or in your house?
In my house, especially at midnight, that's my place when I sit down on the bed and I silent and I pray. That's all the time since I was high school.
Others?
Well, in the summertime, I like sitting on my balcony. They were just surrounded by trees and plants in my patio. And that's where I like to wander.
Yes. I have the privilege of having a hut in the backyard that I built for this purpose. Our neighbor was getting rid of windows, and I know that windows are very expensive, so I hoarded these for a couple of years before I could build a hut to go around it. But it's a special place for me. Now that we don't have our kids at home, then it isn't quite as necessary, but it's still, whenever I go there, then I have this, and I can just look out over the greenery and flowers and the garden and so on. Any places, perhaps you've only been there once, where you just had that sense of...
Well, at Fish Trap Creek Park, there was that little raised platform looking out over the Clover, or the whatever it is, lake.
Yes.
And I haven't done that for quite a while, but that used to be a favorite spot.
Yeah, I know which one you speak of.
I would say our deck is also a place where I like to escape to. We have a monstrous cedar tree, which kind of comes right to the deck. But I love to listen to the birds.
Yes.
And I sit there. Not the traffic, but just have to kind of get my head around, or my ears stop to the traffic. But yeah, that's a special place.
Thanks for hearing that.
I think earlier when you mentioned is that ordinary life allows me to sort of consider every place that I go as being a special place. Although I know at home I have a sitting room where I'm there every morning. So that, but when I'm away from that room, I don't necessarily think of it like when you ask.
Yeah.
It's not that, but it's real. But I think the idea is that I'm picking up different, I'll call them landmarks or just God marks, because it doesn't matter where I am. So practicing silence and practicing solitude.
I think the one nice thing about going away though, that you don't have the feeling that if you hear a phone, you don't need to answer.
Yes.
You know, there's something, and leaving the home, the distractions of home that can distract you. Just leave them.
Yeah, like we had company for 2 weeks around our Joel and Rachel's wedding, and we went away after that. We just needed to get away so that we wouldn't be reminded of all the things that needed to be done. Jesus experienced the same thing. I'd like to read Mark 21, or Mark 1, verses 21 to 39. This is a typical day in the life of Jesus. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were also amazed, and they asked each other, "Who is this? A new teaching? And with authority he even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early the next morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. I hope you noticed verse 35. In the midst of a busy 24-hour period, as I like to call it, all of a sudden there's that verse 35. And in the middle of it all, Jesus withdraws and has silence and solitude, where he just stops all the good. Jesus is doing a lot of good. But in the middle of all that, all of a sudden just the withdrawal and not doing anything, just another text which Rachel preached on some time ago, and she she brought out the other side of the story, which was very good. It was an excellent sermon. I wish she would preach more. But I'm going to emphasize the one part of it here, because Jesus also brings that out. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about so many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Again, it is not saying that service is bad. Mary is being a good host, or Martha is being a good host. But Jesus says the central thing is what Mary had chosen, and that is just to be with me. And that might be a good lesson for all of us in our hospitality, is our guests want to be with us, not watch us work all the time. And that is perhaps all of us who do hospitality sometimes get so busy with making all the preparations that we don't have time to just be with our guests. And Jesus says that's the primary thing, is just to be together. It's more important to be with Jesus than spend time with him than to just do things for him. I love this quote. I came across this quote probably 40 years ago when I was a very, very busy youth pastor. And I read this book called The Center of Quiet by David Runcorn. He said, if work for God is stopping us from being with God, then we need to take a hard look at our priorities. And that really hit me as a very busy young pastor. And an ancient quote from Bernard of Clairvaux, more than 1,000 years ago, or not quite 1,000 years ago, actually. "If you are wise, you will show yourself a reservoir and not a canal. For a canal pours out as fast as it takes in, but a reservoir waits till it is full before it overflows, and so communicates its surplus. We have all too few such reservoirs in the church at present, though we have canals in plenty. They desire to pour out when they themselves are not yet inpoured. They are readier to speak than to listen, eager to teach that which they do not know, and most anxious to exercise authority on others, although they have not learned to rule themselves." In other words, fill up first before giving out. Sometimes we serve out of an empty tank, so to speak. I want to draw a bit of a contrast between these two analogies that we've had here. The canal and Martha, and the reservoir and Mary. And kind of contrast two different ways of ordering our lives. And then we'll pause and have a bit of some questions or observations. So I call this the doing mode and the being mode, where I got the title. We are human beings, not human doings. So the doing mode is our default. In a Western capitalist society, Protestant work ethic, Mennonite work ethic even more than the Protestant work ethic. We have a doing mode. That's our default way of operating in life. Anybody that doesn't operate that way, we usually consider them lazy. And by the way, I'm not advocating laziness here. There's a difference between practicing Sabbath and silence and solitude and sloth, which is one of the 7 deadly sins. The doing mode pays attention to our own actions, everything that we're doing. Whereas the being mode pays attention to God's actions. And I don't think this is just a matter of semantics, that we participate in what God is doing rather than we do stuff and then ask God to bless what we're doing. I think there's a difference. And then, of course, that involves then of discerning and listening and watching for what God is doing in our world, and then participating. Activity plus spirituality, and I'll give you a youth ministry story again. So a youth pastor plans activities. Well, I'm a youth pastor, so I'd better have a prayer in there somewhere to bless our whatever we're doing in our activity. But if you operate the other way, spirituality leads to activity. Out of the depth of my own prayer life and my own relationship with God, I will then plan activities for my youth. And I don't even have to have a prayer to bless those activities, because those activities are coming from a deeper place. I am doing them because that is my participation in what God is doing in the world. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's a different way of looking at things. And often, because this focuses on doing, then we are really excited about novel shortcuts, ways that can help us to be more efficient. Whereas the being mode is all about old spiritual practices, such as silence, solitude, prayer, service, worship. There's nothing magic or new or, there's no kind of, we sometimes talk about, what would help young people to come to church? I don't think there's some sort of novel shortcuts or adding smoke rising from the stage or more drums or something. That is really not what young people are after. They are after some depth, I believe. And again, it's not a magic fix. We practice ancient spiritual practice, all the young people are going to flock to us. It's just about doing the right thing. Whether people come or not is not the point. After all, Jesus only had 12 disciples and one of them wanted to kill him. So it's not about numbers. It's about practicing some depth and, again, exchanging one way for a different way. Because we are human beings, not human doings. The essence of being human is to just be. We don't have to do anything to earn God's love. All you have to do is exist. That's enough for God to love you. And yet we feel, because the doing mode is our default, we feel that we have to do something to earn God's approval. But by accepting God's approval, that motivates me then to do something. It's a different order.
That's the irony.
Yeah. Again, it's nothing wrong with doing things, but it comes out of a different place. Stories from your life or questions?
I have often noticed that when I'm preparing for something, let's say worship leading, you know, you want to get it done, you want to do this and this and this, and it's really only when you sort of stop and listen that some of those things just kind of fall in place and not sometimes not even how you had thought it might.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's not that this is now the magic potion to get it done. It's just because that it comes from a different place. Yeah, it was similar with my sermon for this week. I mean, obviously I've known my topic for over a month, so it's kind of been percolating. But then the last week, the pressure mounts for it to get it done.
I still think there's an irony and to separate the two ideas is a challenge, because in listening and allowing the Spirit to move within us, and when the Spirit is speaking with us, does an action have to follow? And it begs, it's how to interpret who's doing what, who's leading whom.
Yes.
And that's why I know that you can't help but divide the two subjects into two.
Yeah.
But if there was a way that you could change that image so that we would see an overlap, that would see no different than you all of a sudden noticed that you were away from the camera, so that you had to come back into that space.
Alignment in a sense.
So it's how are we going to live into these two ideas, and who's going to motivate us to hear and then listen, but then acting is also a necessity, because the Spirit is going to say do something.
Yeah, it will come out of that.
It will come out of that, but then it begs that when do we transition from the Spirit is leading to now I'm doing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
yeah. It's not always easy to discern. It's not as nice as a diagram on a PowerPoint. I like diagrams because it helps me to, I think I said this the first lecture we talked about, when you're working with a mystery, then you have to find words or pictures or diagrams or charts to help me to work with that mystery. But the diagram or the chart or the word is never completely adequate. But at least it helps me to work with that which you can't put into a picture or a word. It's like the preaching series that Rod had here on metaphors for God. That's all we have to talk about God is metaphors. Because God is someone we don't understand and can't see, so we have to have metaphors. Like, in a sense, this diagram is a metaphor for our spiritual life and for our struggles. But our struggles are never quite this easy.
I like your idea of integration of the two somehow, because, for example, if you read a church paper, what catches your attention or mine is somebody that's doing something, not just sitting in an armchair thinking I should be doing something.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And the Mennonite tradition is very active, but I think we have been drinking more at the contemplative tradition of late. Mennonites have realized that MCC service is kind of like, that's always what I think, the epitome of spirituality is somebody who works for MCC. They're out there doing something. But they also need their inner core to be recharged. Otherwise, again, they're serving out of an empty tank.
And that's been a gift from the Catholic Church.
Exactly. From the medieval church before Anabaptism ever was. All the way back to the 4th century. The 4th century was a time of great Christian popularity. And then that's when the monastic tradition started. It said, you know, I don't think this is what Christianity is meant to be, this popular thing out in the streets. It's meant to be about a daily, rigorous prayer and service and so on. And so they said, well, I guess we have to move somewhere else. And that's where I think the monastic tradition fails sometimes, is that it is a complete, and where Mennonites have failed sometimes, is that it's a complete separation from the messiness of the world.
Although I think
Where it's meant to be practiced in the middle of.
but when we think of our Mennonite tribes, like there are the more conservative groups, which I think is speaking a bit to what you're trying to say.
They get away geographically. It's a
But
tradition
even their
among all of us.
lifestyle.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with a unique lifestyle. But if that begins to be the be-all and the end-all, again, it doesn't come out of that core. Just some consequences, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because this is the bad news. But we all know from experience where the doing mode ends up for us. Pretentiousness. In other words, you've heard the mantra, fake it till you make it. You know, I'm not really into this, but I'll just kind of do it. We kind of put on almost a charade for others. And pretend we can, but in a sense, we can perhaps fake it for a while, you know, and paste on that plastic smile. But we generally know the truth about ourselves, and it often will come out sooner or later anyway, and might come out in ways that we don't understand, or would not appreciate, or others might not appreciate. So it's best to just be honest. I began my sermon this last Sunday saying that I felt somewhat discombobulated. And, well, that's not who are you to be preaching if that's how you're feeling? And yet I felt the need to be honest. This was where I was coming from. I don't want to go here and just pretend it's all good. Oh yeah, I'm so close to God, you know. If somebody does that, they're probably putting on a show.
Now I'm realizing why it stops is because it's asking me to sign on the internet, which I'm not doing here.
And often meaninglessness. We are busy with all sorts of activity, but none of them bring us really any sense of purpose. We're busy but empty. A wonderful quote from Henry Nouwen. And this is perhaps again, this is a quote I came across as a youth pastor. Being busy has become a status symbol. Everybody was comparing how busy they were in their ministry. I remember so many meetings. The more burnt out you were and busy you were, the more spiritual somehow you thought. While our minds and hearts are filled with many things and we wonder how we can live up to expectations imposed upon us by ourselves and others, we have a deep sense of unfulfillment. While busy with and worried about many things, we seldom feel truly satisfied at peace or at home. A gnawing sense of being unfulfilled underlies our filled lives. This is why, and many of you are older, you have learned this because you've been forced to retire, as we call it in our society, but we are forced to slow down. We have to. And that's why you become so much deeper spiritually in your old age, because you are slowing down. If we would just learn this a little sooner in life, before we're forced to. And if we keep going in the doing mode, we become about as deep as a puddle. The consequences worsen. Being busy all the time, we neglect our inner, deeper selves. We begin to live superficial lives, preoccupied with trivial details. And that's when some of the negative consequences might rear their ugly heads. So let's get on to more positive things. So I want to propose that we enter the being mode by practicing Sabbath. Perhaps the first step in entering that being mode is to keep the fourth commandment. That is, to keep the Sabbath. Not because we want to, but because we need to. God commanded it for our own good. As I said, Sabbath simply means to stop. To stop being busy, to stop with our normal everyday activities. So, we're going to practice it right now. You don't have to think about a Bible verse, so I put one up here. By the way, this picture is of a monastery, and I love the church sign because most times in the walk up to the church and in the foyer, that's where you have the most noise. And here, about 30 or 40 feet before you go in the church, they have a sign that tells you to shut up, which I found just interesting. Again, that's not our tradition, but I thought maybe it's a good idea. So we're going to practice it for just a minute, to do nothing, to just sit and be quiet. In fact, I'm going to leave the room for a while so I can just be away for a while. Put that in here in the middle of the lecture just to illustrate that sometimes in the middle of cleaning the house or washing the dishes or whatever we're doing, it's just good to take a minute and just... Sometimes it works better when you're done. But in the middle of, we don't have to go to a special place. But there can be those moments where we just remind ourselves, God loves me just the way I am. I don't have to do anything to earn God's love, except just be. Like Elsiana on the bed at midnight. Just,
yeah, that's my place. Like quiet.
and just to take that moment and just be, and then you can go back to sleep again.
The silent, I like that one. When I went to West Mennonite Church, they used to play organ that lead us. go into that entrance and you sit and silent. And then the organ still play there. Feel very quiet. Yeah.
The interesting thing is, we still think we have to have the organ music. If it was completely silent, we might feel really uncomfortable. But now that I'm in charge of worship services, maybe I'll start putting in a moment of silence in some worship services.
Well, we have done that in prayer.
Yeah, we have done
We
it,
have
yeah.
done that.
Yeah.
So which I think probably we're more comfortable with that than a number of congregations would be.
We are becoming more so, I think,
Yeah.
yeah. And our society, I think, is realizing that we need those times. So I hope it's becoming more common.
I came across as I'm thinking it's St. John the Cross or St. John of the Cross,
St. John of the Cross.
but he says in prayer, come empty, do nothing. So when I bumped into that in my sort of regular reading, like I'm reminded of the fact that if I am empty, am I able to receive something with my head or with my heart? So those two are competing, and that's why I see the doing and the thinking, or the doing and the being it's the tension between my mind and my heart. And so I'm aware of the struggle.
Yeah, and this is part of a course I taught where we taught 12 different practices. The one that usually follows this one is either prayer or meditation, because both of them start here. Like prayer, we often say is talking to God, but prayer is also listening to God. And meditation, there's a couple of different methods of meditation as well. One is focused on our heads and our thoughts. The other is more focused on the heart and our emotions or our affections. And so when we meditate on the scriptures or meditate on aspects of creation, that also begins with silence. We were taught on one retreat that I went on to focus on one piece of creation for an hour, either a leaf or something. I focused on a moth for an hour. It began to be tedious, I thought, but I followed it around. The moth didn't move more than 3 feet in that hour. But it was a good exercise just to stop. Sorry, Elsie, I'm going to cut you
Yeah,
off.
it's my experience in Cambodia, at that time. It's a chaos, Even I pick at the night, people just, over a motorcycle at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the other day I picked from my bedroom, I saw, a flashlight, and like somebody was steal something. The next morning, I asked the neighbor, can you check at the back of your home, did you have something somebody stealing? And she said, yes, I saw that time, 2 o'clock in the morning. And then my experience, when Ellen was asleep, I think it's 1 o'clock at the time. I don't know, in my heart, I would like to talk to God. I open the windows. I never close my windows because the wind comes in. Because when you have meditation, any temptation can bother your mind.
Yeah.
But before that meditation, I pray to God. God, please, don't let any temptation bother my mind when I talk to you. It takes a silent 1 hour. And then the next hour, that's everything so very light. My heart is quiet. This is very light.
Yeah.
And I can get communicated.
Then you are truly being.
Yeah,
Yes.
2 hours it takes from beginning to the end.
So the 1 minute we had is not nearly enough. You barely get to relax.
Yeah.
Let's look at the Sabbath commands to help us to understand the practice of the Sabbath. By the way, did you know that the Ten Commandments appear in two places in the Bible, in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And the Ten Commandments are identical in both places except for the Sabbath command is different in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Let's look at the Exodus one first of all. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So what is the first purpose for the Sabbath? To rest. Because, as Genesis 1 says, because God rested. Let's look at Deuteronomy. Chapter 5, verses 12 and 15. And note the difference here. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, female or male servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, or any foreigner residing in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. This time the therefore is different. Last time it was hearkening back to the creation. Now it is hearkening back to the Exodus. A second purpose for the Sabbath is to remember what God has done in the past. So to rest and to remember. And I like to say this is why we go to church on the Sabbath, to help us to remember, to hear from others what God has done in their lives, to remember through practices such as communion. And communion is a memory of what God has done, which is why I would advocate for communion more often, so that we remember more often what God has done for us. So to rest and to remember are the two purposes of the Sabbath. And sometimes, and again, the meaning of Sabbath is to stop. So you stop to rest, and often if you keep going, you also tend to forget. But when you stop, then you can remember. It's just like if you're lost, sometimes it helps to stop and get your bearings, and then you'll remember how to get there. But if you keep driving in a panic, it gets harder. This is where especially men have problems on that. Stop, ask for directions.
What about like Adventists and the Jewish, The Sabbath is Saturday.
Yes.
Adventists too. It's totally, different with what we did.
Yes, yes. And the practice of Sunday as a Sabbath began because Jesus was raised on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but since you raised the question now, I'll speak to it now. I don't think it's about which 24-hour day is the Sabbath. To me, Sabbath is a principle. It's about moments, it's about minutes, it's about hours, it's about days, it's about weeks, months, years. It is about time, but I don't think it's just about a particular day. A common Sabbath helps us to practice Sabbath communally, but I have problems when we get a bit too legalistic, and we'll talk about legalism a little bit later.
But there is another story, like against two of the Is it disciple when they look at somebody, is it called that name? They ask Jesus, can I help, that person?
Yes, exactly, yeah. We'll get to that right here.
Oh.
You're ahead of me. So Jesus seems to have a bit of an uneasy relationship with a lot of Old Testament commands, not just the Sabbath. But more so, he didn't say we shouldn't practice the Old Testament commands. What I think the problem was is the way that people were practicing it. For example, I'll turn to Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 3, verse 6. On one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat, and also gave some to his companions." This was holy bread. It was set aside for communion. And David and his guys were hungry, so they ate it. And so Jesus uses this story to make his point. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath." In other words, the Sabbath is a gift to us. We are not meant to constrain into a particular law. That particular law was given to benefit us and to help us to be more human, in a sense. I'll continue. So the Son of Humanity is Lord even of the Sabbath. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent because they knew he had them. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So the Sabbath is a principle to help us to be human beings. It's not a law that we have to fit ourselves into. The law is there to help us to be. And the Pharisees and many of us get that wrong. So it's good to eat together, to go to somebody's place for a meal on the Sabbath. That used to be the practice in the rural area where I grew up. Every Sunday you would visit at least with one other family. And today perhaps the equivalent would be to go out to a restaurant. Oh, but you're making the other people work. Well, again, this is getting caught in our legalism here if we go there. It's good to have eating and companionship. It's good to heal and to do good things on the Sabbath, even if it might be considered work. If somebody's got a flat tire on the side of the road, do some work and help them out. It's like the cow falling down in the well sort of thing.
I forget the writer, and he talked about Edwards, about Sabbath, and that for him as a preacher, his Sabbath was garment, because it was so different from what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other people might look at it as work.
Yes.
But for him, it was R&R.
Yeah, the same for me. As an academic, there is nothing better than to get sweaty and to work hard in my yard. That is my Sabbath activity. Not to read a book. That's too much like work. Whereas for most people who work physically, reading a book is a good thing. It gets your mind off of your hard work that you've done. If you work with people, then it's perhaps good on your Sabbath to get away from people for a bit. there have been some problems with Sabbath keeping, and I see two of them that are kind of opposites to each other. One is to ignore the Sabbath principle and just to keep working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Like just work. This is kind of capitalism at its worst. Is just to work to make more money so we can finally have a Sabbath when I'm 55 and then keel over dead because he worked too hard. But the problem that Christians have often had is to turn the Sabbath into legalism, which is still doing. You're still looking at the Sabbath as something to do or not do, as it were. You make laws about it. I remember growing up, I grew up on a farm, so I appreciate that my dad did not do the combining on Sunday. That was just his rule. It was wrong to go combining. Even he did feed the animals on Sunday. That was okay, but combining was wrong on a Sunday, even if it was a sunny day. And Cindy's father, the same way. The farm didn't continue in my family, but in Cindy's family, her brother combines on Sunday. Has no problem with it. I don't think he's breaking the Sabbath. I think he's practicing it differently. Then he'll do it the next week when it rains or something. Perhaps you could, I won't get into his personal story, but again, I don't think it's about a legalism where we say, this is the way you keep the Sabbath and this isn't. The point is that we all know that we need sometimes to stop.
So it means Sabbath not just only for ourselves, but for the people that you hire to work with.
Yes.
Yeah.
There can be a way that bosses can make other people work too hard, yes. As employers, obviously, and I think workers generally appreciate this, and thankfully we have laws in our society that give Sabbath, even if it may not be for Sabbath reasons, but I think because this is a human law, it helps us to be human beings.
Marcia Johnson told us a story of when she visited in Germany, and she said on the Sabbath, on the Sunday, all the trucks pulled over beside the road, and there was no commercial truck traffic on a Sunday.
Wow, yeah.
And I thought, that's not so bad, because the whole country slowed down
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that one day.
yeah.
Well, I think it used to be more so here as well, and then soon found that they could earn as much money on a Sunday
Yeah,
And the
as any
stores
other
used to be
day.
closed on Sunday.
yeah.
Our daughter's boyfriend is working as a reserve officer, and so he was on a 2-week mission in a camp or a fire where the first responders were working. And in that time, he had to commit to basically a 12-hour day, 7 days, like there was no break.
Yeah.
So it begs that the circumstances are going to lead to the principle. I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. And I hope if that person, first responder, was a church member, the church didn't kick him out because he didn't practice the Sabbath. Sometimes it's necessary, and a Sabbath will come for that person.
Yes.
That's why, to me, it's the principle of the thing, not to boil it down to a particular law. Then it becomes just as much about doing as to just keep doing. And this is what we're doing already. Which of these is most common in your experience? I just looked at the time. Let's look at our for me, the solution is about rhythm. To have a work-rest rhythm. Human beings are rhythmic creatures, from our beating hearts to the fact that we want to dance to a rhythm when music comes on. We are rhythmic beings. We have daytime and we have nighttime. It's a rhythm. And there are people who have a different kind of rhythm. People who work shift work have to develop a different kind of rhythm, or those who are nurses who work nights need to develop a different kind of rhythm. But it's important to have some kind of rhythm. that because I think our bodies, that's the way we're made. We're made to be rhythmic. And we also have that rhythm of doing and being. It is about timing, just like music has timing and dancing has timing, so life has timing. And that timing of rest, remember, and also of doing and being, it's important to get that rhythm. And again, it's important that we don't judge other people's whose rhythms might be a bit different from ours. And people's shifts change, so your rhythms sometimes change. Jeff, you have different shifts, like you work on and off, so your rhythm sometimes looks different, and that probably does something to you sometimes when your rhythm changes. Because I think most people like to keep a similar rhythm.
What implications does that have for church life, or congregational life? Because we have a lot of people in different kinds of rhythms, and somehow the church has been, it's a Sunday morning thing.
Yeah,
Only.
yeah.
You know, and so when we think of the church of the future, what does that mean as far as the gathering? Whether
Right.
it's everybody or segments of.
There's no rule that says we have to meet every week on a Sunday morning.
No, but there, that's true.
So I'm saying, yes, we do need to find perhaps a new rhythm.
A new rhythm, and it might be for some on Wednesday, some Sunday morning, some whatever. But then there's also that total group, you know, also that the time for gathering. So it's much more fluid, I think. But it can feel a little bit sort of, make us feel a little uncomfortable that it's so sort of loosey-goosey, or it feels loosey-goosey.
Yeah. And yet, I would say, we always come back to the core principle. Not to just throw it out and say, well, we can't find a rhythm together, so let's just whatever. Either scrap meeting altogether, or we'll just do it the way we've always done it. I think both are not good responses. I think a second solution, aside from restoring rhythm, is silence and solitude. To strip ourselves of the things that we're addicted to.
Again, it wants to be get on the internet.
Noise and people. Too often our church gatherings are also noisy and shallow. To take time for silence and solitude on a Sabbath, hopefully you have times, it's good to gather, hopefully you have times to be alone the rest of on your Sabbath day. The result of practicing this, and I want to end with the good news here. The result of practicing silent solitude and Sabbath is that we will be centered. To center means to orient or reorient our lives. If we are centered on Christ, we can remain at peace even in the most active or stressful circumstances. You have that chorus, Jesus be the center. I want to tell you the story of tetherball. Some of you may be familiar with this game. Tetherball, you have this ball on a string, and you have two people who hit at the ball to try and make it wind around there in a certain direction. So the ball tends to fly very erratically in this game. But the point is that if it is centered, you can wind it around there. And so also the practices of silence, solitude, and Sabbath can help to center us. Even though our lives may swing erratically out of control sometimes, if we are centered on that pole, we could say the pole is Jesus, then we can withstand that those erratic swings of our lives. A second illustration I have, the top-loading washing machine. Sometimes you will notice when you are doing laundry, if you have a top loader, that the machine starts moving around the room erratically. Well, then what you have to do is you open the lid, you rearrange the clothing evenly around the center, and then again you can do your laundry. In the same way, sometimes we need to just stop and open ourselves to God's Spirit and rearrange our lives. Sometimes every day we do this. Rearrange our lives around that center, and then we can go about our lives again. But you need to have that act of just stopping and rearranging things. Another quote from Richard Wagamese. I am my silence. I am not the busyness of my thoughts or the daily rhythm of my actions. I am not the stuff that constitutes my world. I am not my talk. I am not my actions. I am my silence. I am the consciousness that perceives all these things. When I go to my consciousness, that simply means realizing that we are alive, realizing that I am. To that great pool of silence that observes the intricacies of my life, I am aware that I am me. I take a little time each day to sit in silence so that I can move outward in balance into the great clamor of living. I love that. So just by being silent with myself for a little time, or perhaps we would say by myself with being aware of God's presence with me, then just for that moment, it helps me to then face the great clamor of whatever awaits us in the day. I know mothers with young children will have been able to relate to this. You need that because you're going to get the onslaught. Or Cindy, who teaches kindergarten, needs this in the morning.
When I was a school bus driver, I sure needed those.
Yes, oh yeah.
Those breaks for centering and calming.
Yes.
My grandfather and my grandmother would just put her apron over her face.
Oh yeah.
And that was essential.
Yeah.
That was sort of, that was, no one was to disturb her.
Yeah.
She had 12 children, 13.
Yeah. And of course, with a kindergarten class like Cindy has, they have a moment of quiet where they just all do this centering. And it's a wonderful practice. And as we become aware of the Spirit's presence with us, it begins to be a deeper practice that isn't just about the psychology of it, but it's also about the spirituality of it. And actually, before I close, any other questions or comments? I want to end with the psalm. I know I always said 7 to 8:30, but I like to be done by 8:15, so we all feel good that we're done early.
I came across the part about where Thomas was asked Lord and says, Lord, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way? And I've been reading it from a multitude of translations, but this is from the New English Bible, which spoke to me. It says, Jesus replied, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am life. And that struck me because the life could just be an idea, but no, Jesus is the life, and that's who is within me,
Yeah.
and that's who's asking to live himself out through me. That's different than an idea.
Yeah.
It's now a person.
Yeah. It's a person, exactly. And the same goes with the way is a person.
Yes.
It's not certain things you have to do. Or the truth is not a statement of faith with 24 articles. It's a person.
Yes. But it's getting from the idea to the person is, I
Yeah.
think, what is starting to register.
Yeah.
But it's generally being preached as an idea.
Yes, oh, very much so. Especially the truth part, and even the way part. It's all, yeah, it's...
And even the life part, that's what
Yeah.
struck me, is that, no.
Yeah, yeah, and it's all a person. It's the I am. So that's why I think this discipline also gets us at that core of, I also am,
Yes.
to just be in God's presence. I don't have to do anything or believe certain things or do certain things. It's just,
But that's what Richard is saying in that last sentence. If I sit each day in silence to experience that,
yeah.
I like, sometimes I've started now to watch the YouTube of N.T. Wright. He has these 5 to 8 minute reflections on a verse. And, but he gives the verse, and then all of a sudden he says, well, we have to make some tea first. And then we watch him drink tea for a
Yes.
bit.
Oh, yeah.
And then he starts.
That's good.
I thought, after a while, I figured out what he's doing is getting us to calm down
Ah,
and focus on him drinking tea, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
And we have to stop. Because when he gives the verse, right away our mind is going, start to run. But then all of a sudden it stops.
Yeah, that's good, that's good. He's a wise man. I love Psalm 132 verses 1 and 2. Again, I'm a man. I don't get this personally, but I can imagine it. And by the way, this is the picture of God as a breastfeeding mother. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. A weaned child is when it is not breastfeeding anymore. Before that, the child is with the mother to get something from the mother. This is the picture of the weaned child, is just to be with mom, not for what her breasts can give me, but just to be contented in the presence of God. Not for what God can give me, but just to be. I love that picture of contentedness. And that's my prayer for my life, that I would have that sense of contentedness, is to be able to just be. And I think that might motivate me toward perhaps more wholesome and less frenetic actions than if I forget that. So thanks for coming, and I hope you will have moments of the triple S at some point in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you,
Thank
Gary.
you.
Thank you.
And our last one in the series will be the 28th of September, where we'll look at why it's important for the church to commemorate the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Since the Day of Truth and Reconciliation is the 30th of September. It's a government holiday, but I think it's a very important one for the church, and so I'm going to give you some background as to why I think it's important for the church.